So let's turn now to the roadmap strategies. States made considerable headway on implementing the 6 effective strategies that are included in the roadmap. Now, strategies have strong evidence that they work to improve prenatal to 3 policy goals. However, the research is less clear on how states should actually implement the strategies to make it so that they can be brought to scale and really maximize their impact. So for strategies, we don't indicate whether a state has fully implemented or not with a yes or a no, the way that we do with policies. Instead, we've identified 5 states for each strategy that we call leaders or states to watch. It was extremely difficult to narrow the selection to 5 states because there is such great work going on across this country. But we made our decisions based on a combination of several elements, including such things as the state is bringing the strategy to scale and serving a large number of eligible children, or the state uses innovative funding strategies, or the state made substantial investments in the strategy in this past year. And so states that are interested in expanding their implementation of a specific strategy should look to these leaders for and see what they have done for guidance on what you can do. Extensive information on what each of these states is doing is available in each state's summary in the roadmap and in the profiles for each strategy. But let's take a moment to celebrate the leaders and also recognize the efforts of many states towards expanding these effective strategies. So let's begin with comprehensive screening and connection programs. These evidence-based programs use screening tools to identify the needs of children and families and connect them to the targeted programs and services that they actually need. And state leaders in this strategy either have a high percentage of families who access the programs, they've enacted legislation to reach families across the state, or they've invested deeply in evidence-based programs. So this year, we'd like to recognize California for being the only state that offers all 3 of the universal evidence-based models that are in the roadmap. We also want to recognize Colorado, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Oregon for their efforts in implementing the Family Connects model statewide. Also, this past year, New York made a substantial investment in the Healthy Steps model, which supplements the child's pediatric well visits with a developmental specialist who assesses the needs of the family and makes sure that those needs are addressed. And there are several other states, including New Mexico, Tennessee, Iowa, Hawaii, Minnesota, Massachusetts, Kentucky, and Rhode Island, who offer their own alternative model to universally screening families and connecting them with services. And their programs seem very promising. And what we're doing is watching and hoping that these program models are rigorously evaluated so that we can provide even more evidence-based options to states. Next is group prenatal care. And group prenatal care provides education, support, and obstetric care to pregnant people with similar gestational age in a group setting. And state leaders in this strategy offer financial support for group prenatal care. They provide enhanced reimbursement rates for group prenatal care through Medicaid, or they serve pregnant people in a high number of group prenatal care sites across the state. Selected state leaders include California, Maryland, Montana, Ohio, and South Carolina. In particular, Maryland made an investment of $72 million in Maryland Medicaid to implement the centering pregnancy model throughout the state, which is really impressive. Next is evidence-based home visiting programs. These programs provide support and education to new parents in their home through either a trained professional or a paraprofessional. And state leaders in this strategy serve a substantial percentage of low-income families with young children, and they use state dollars or Medicaid to support home visiting services. We want to recognize the state leaders of Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Maine, and New York. Well done to those states. But there were other states that made investments that's important to recognize. For example, California and Illinois both passed legislation to expand resources to families in the programs this past year. And Rhode Island, Washington, Arkansas, and New Hampshire all increased their funding for home visiting programs. And Ohio became the 24th state to begin using Medicaid to fund portions of home visiting services. It began incorporating home visiting programs into its targeted case management benefit. So good job. Next is Early Head Start. As we know, Early Head Start serves our low-income pregnant people, as well as infants and toddlers and their families through comprehensive child development and family services, which can be delivered in a variety of formats. And state leaders in this strategy have a state-specific program that has the same standards as Early Head Start. They provide state financial support for Early Head Start, or they serve a substantial percentage of their low-income children. And we want to recognize the District of Columbia, Maine, Massachusetts, Nebraska, and Oregon for their efforts in Early Head Start. Nebraska and Oregon have their own state-specific program that's modeled on Early Head Start standards. DC and Maine serve a large proportion of their eligible children in the program. And Massachusetts and Oregon made substantial investments in Early Head Start this past year. Massachusetts invested in the EHS workforce, and Oregon increased the number of state-funded slots by nearly 25%. So congratulations to all of those states. Next is early intervention services, and these are child and family-centered services and therapies that support the healthy development of infants and toddlers who have disabilities or developmental delays or who are at risk for delays. And state leaders in this strategy serve a substantial percentage of children under age 3. They use innovative approaches to increase their eligibility for children, or they maximize the use of Medicaid to pay for EI services. And congratulations to the leaders in early intervention, who are Connecticut, Illinois, Massachusetts, New Mexico, and Rhode Island. California, Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania also took legislative or administrative action to enhance their EI services this past year. And it's really important to see the number of children who are served expand. Finally, are child care subsidies. And child care subsidies provide financial assistance to help make child care more affordable for working parents who have lower levels of income. State leaders in this strategy provide high reimbursement rates that meet the provider's true cost of care. They require low family copays and have a low family share of the total cost of child care. Or they have expanded income eligibility thresholds. Now, states have made incredible progress on this strategy this past year, which I'm going to discuss in more detail in just a minute. But 5 states that are really leading the pack include California, Louisiana, Michigan, New Mexico, and Oregon. Boy, this list was very difficult to limit to 5 states because so many states are making innovative policy changes. But we wanted to recognize and congratulate these exceptional leaders. So although we recognized 5 exemplar states for each of the strategies, it's important to point out that 2 states, California and Washington, they were considered leaders in 3 of the roadmap strategies. So California was a leader in our comprehensive screening and connection programs, our child care subsidy policies, and in group prenatal care. And Oregon is a state leader in comprehensive screening and connection programs, child care subsidies, and early Head Start. So those states, along with Washington, who became a 5 out of 5, well, they show us that great things are happening for children and families on the West Coast. 5 additional states are leaders in 2 of the strategies. And that includes Connecticut, Illinois, Massachusetts, Maine, and New Mexico. And congratulations for your excellent work. And others should look to you to really understand how they can implement these strategies. There are 14 states that were leaders in at least one of the roadmap strategies. And so altogether, we're recognizing 21 states as leaders in at least one of the effective strategies. And this includes large states and small states and red and blue states and from all of the geographic regions across the country, really illustrating the impressive work to support children and families that's being done throughout the United States. As I mentioned, states were incredibly active this past year in enhancing their child care subsidy policies. As we know, subsidies provide an essential resource to families to help them access affordable child care. And research shows that higher subsidy reimbursement rates, they increase employment, and they lead to greater stability in child care arrangements. But too frequently, reimbursement rate levels are set below the amount that would be necessary for families to be able to access high-quality care or for child care providers to pay their teachers a living wage. And state leaders in childcare subsidies are setting their rates at levels that cover the true cost of care, and they have reasonable expectations of what the family can pay in copays. And this combination of these two policies lead to families being responsible for a relatively small percentage of the overall price of care. Although most of the funding for childcare subsidies comes from federal sources, states have substantial latitude in how they implement their programs. And over the past year, states made many improvements to their childcare systems by either executive order or agency actions. And several states passed legislation to expand eligibility, increase reimbursement rates, cap family copayments, and other things. So in total, 17 states expanded the income threshold that makes families eligible for childcare subsidies. The federal government sets 85% of a state's median income as the eligibility threshold for using federal funds, but state dollars, the states can use state dollars to increase the eligibility beyond that level, and some do. In fact, income eligibility thresholds range from 140% of the state median income in New Mexico to only 40% of the state median income in Indiana. We also saw that 15 states reduced the required copayments that families have to pay to access the subsidized slots. This year, families with incomes at 150% of the federal poverty level pay nothing or nearly nothing in copayments in 11 states, and that's a huge improvement over last year. We also saw that 35 states worked to support providers and families by increasing the reimbursement rates this year. Louisiana really led those efforts by nearly doubling its reimbursement rates and reducing the overall family share of childcare costs. But Michigan also significantly increased its reimbursement rates and decreased the amount charged to families in the state this year. And there are 3 states, DC, New Mexico, and now Virginia, that have moved toward a model of setting reimbursement rates that's based on the true cost of providing quality childcare rather than the market rate survey. And this model is expected to increase rates and ultimately wages for childcare educators. And we are seeing that several other states are considering moving in this direction. Okay, this graphic, it illustrates the wide variation across states in their childcare policies. I realize that these numbers are way too small to see any particular state. It's in the roadmap though. But this figure shows how the market price for childcare varies substantially across states. The length of the bar is that equal access target for childcare subsidies, which the federal government defines as the 75th percentile of a recent market rate survey. And despite the enormous improvements to reimbursement rates and copays in many states, there is still substantial variation in the amount that providers charge families for care and the amount that states will reimburse providers to offer subsidized childcare. That first blue bar, that's the amount that the state pays providers directly. And the navy is the amount of the base reimbursement rate that the state requires that families have to pay for a subsidized slot or the copay. The teal bar is the additional amount or the fee that families have to pay in order to access that equal access target or the quality target. And that fee plus the Navy copay adds up to a family's out-of-pocket childcare expenses. So for more information, I really do encourage you to check out all of the graphics in the childcare subsidy profile that's in the roadmap. And I want to also note that we recognize that several states have updated the reimbursement rates even as of October 1st, and we're going to update that information over time to reflect these changes. But in order to get all of this done, this information in the roadmap was current for all states as of early September. In recognition of the immense challenges that the childcare market is facing, we chose to focus the following panel on just that issue alone. We not only, though, want to highlight the crisis that the market is facing in terms of providers not being able to charge enough to break even, educators not earning enough to live, and families not able to afford quality care, we also wanted to spotlight how state leaders are championing innovative solutions to address this crisis. So first, I was fortunate to have the opportunity to speak with Elliot Haskell, who's a national childcare expert, and he's currently in Europe to learn about childcare there. I spoke with him about how the U.S. childcare system is irrecoverably broken, and the only solution is for sustainable public investments in the system. So I invite you now to listen in on our conversation. Thanks so much for joining me today and having this conversation about this hugely important topic that we know so many states are struggling with. Our childcare market is really in crisis. And I'd love for you to help me and all of us better understand what is really going on with our childcare system right now.
Thanks so much for having me. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. So the childcare system, which as we know was pretty fragile before the pandemic, has been absolutely shattered by the pandemic. And that's hitting providers, that's hitting parents, that's hitting the childcare businesses themselves. And so, just for some context, we've seen still that the childcare industry is down about 85,000 educators from February or March of 2020. And that is across the board in all sorts of different settings. And along with that, we've seen over 16,000 childcare providers close down permanently, and those numbers are as of summer 2021. So it's actually probably significantly higher than that. And we've seen childcare become far more expensive. So it was already obviously exorbitantly expensive for parents, but childcare prices have been rising actually faster than inflation, even in this inflationary era. And part of the reason behind this is we've seen the very sort of tenuous economics of childcare be completely blown up, right? So we already knew childcare fixed costs incredibly high. And that should be, right? It should be expensive to provide quality care when you have low child to adult ratios, when you need to have high quality facilities. And the only way that providers were able to balance their budgets was frankly on the backs of the wages of the workforce. No. And so we had, making $12, $13 an hour as a median wage. And that was bad. And back in the day when you could compete against the Walmarts and McDonald's of the world also offering $12 or $13 an hour, at least there was like a playing field. But there isn't a playing field anymore because those industries have all gone and raised their base compensation, which we should say is great for workers and they should be getting compensated more for that work. But now when Amazon, Target, Walmart, McDonald's, all of these businesses are offering, $17, $18 an hour and decent benefits. It's almost impossible for childcare businesses to compete. And so when you're down workers, as we know, it has this negative vicious cycle where you're putting additional pressure on the staff who remain. So we have studies out of places like Louisiana, Virginia, other states showing, that directors are being forced to ask workers to work longer hours, to not take vacation, right? And in many cases, the directors themselves are being pressed into service as classroom teachers, as cooks, to let that operate. And so you hear this refrain, which we've really not heard very much before the pandemic, which is we have classroom space and they're sitting empty with the lights off and the chairs stacked because there's no one to staff them. And at some point, that creates a budgetary death spiral. I mean, you just aren't bringing enough revenue every month to keep the lights on. And so we're seeing, programs, and again, this is urban area, rural areas, blue states, red states, everywhere, these harrowing stories of programs who've been serving their communities for decades saying, I can't do it anymore. And it's devastating, again, for those programs. It's devastating for the staff, and it's devastating for parents and kids.
Yes. And it's also devastating for some of the economies and the workers who would like to get back into the workplace, but are having a hard time finding a place to leave their children, much less at a place that they trust. Tell us more about what you're seeing that states could do to actually try to shore up this childcare crisis. We know that states are implementing a variety of policies and making changes in several different domains. What have you seen that seems to be working for states and helping to stabilize the market?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in my mind, I have to do multiple things at once. You have to handle the affordability issue for parents. You have to handle quality issues, but workforce looms as the single largest issue right now. And so I like to say it's not so much a both and as a first then. Getting this workforce stabilized is really the prerequisite because you can make it as affordable as you want, but at some point you're handing parents a voucher to nowhere. Because there just are no slots, there are wait lists, right? The programs are going to, again, quality is suffering because there's so much turnover. We know high levels of staff turnover and caregiver turnover is bad for kids. And so when I do think states are trying to stabilize their workforce, we've seen lots of states give out these short-term bonuses. And, I think that's good. But I think we really have to have a conversation about the need for permanent significant increases in public funding that allow programs to offer permanently raised compensation. You talk to directors and you hear this refrain frequently, like, I really don't want to raise my, wages, and then 2 years later have to go back down. Or how do I handle the issue of trying to attract new staff without, the current staff also deserve raises as well? And so it creates these really nasty tensions because we're relying on temporary funding. So we've seen a few states, New Mexico has done this. Washington, D.C., while not a state jurisdiction, has done this. Virginia is prepared to do this, which is changing their cost models. So going more to a true cost of care reimbursement rate, which in some cases is very significant increases, $50, $100, $150 more per child per week type of increases. And that you can actually start to reframe a compensation model around. We've seen some states start to talk about potentially implementing wage scales, right? So you'd have a flat level, you're not going below a floor of a certain wage. And as you increase in experience and credentials, you step up. And so those sorts of structural compensation, structural workforce solutions are really going to be prerequisites for any other attempt to stabilize the sector.
Yeah, the temporary supplements may not be enough to, like you said, to keep folks in the industry. But how are states going to manage this over the long haul? As we know, the ARPA dollars will be drying up in a couple of years. And there are states who are definitely using those in a generous way. Have you seen states that are making real changes to their funding structures that might be more sustainable?
Yeah, so I think this is literally the several $100 million question. It's how do you create a sustainable revenue source? And I do actually say, from my perspective, I think a lot of states are or politicians are not taking the cliff seriously enough. And what I mean by that is, and I think their states doing really bold efforts to try to help working families and try to stabilize the sector in an emergency. And I understand that. But when you're relying on $500 million a year of ARPA money, for the next 2 years, and that's going away. And 2025 is going to be here a lot sooner than we think it is. If there's not a plan, there is going to be a crisis. And that's not an unintended consequence. It's not an unpredictable consequence. It is a known consequence that I think we have to be prepared to plan for. And so, again, you look at what New Mexico is proposing before their voters this fall. It's a constitutional amendment to dedicate a portion of their natural resource revenues into that, right? You look at what Colorado did with their Prop EE, dedicating some of their nicotine and tax to revenue to early childhood. Washington, D.C., where they're raising taxes on the high net worth individuals, dedicating some. So the theme here is they're recurring resources, right? They're not going away. They're there every single year, and they're being dedicated. So they're not at the whims of a given General Assembly session or legislature session. They're not at the whims of a given gubernatorial administration. Because what we've seen in many other areas is that could look great, and then the economy hits a downturn. We're going to pull that away, right? That's not how we fund public education. It's not how we fund, transportation. In most cases, they tend to have their own kind of carve outs, and I think that has to be the route that states take moving forward. What is going to be our dedicated funding source? What is going to generate, hundreds of millions of dollars, knowing that it's an investment? That's the other piece, I think, is we need to start talking about this much more. We're not talking about just a bottomless pit, like throwing money into. We know because of the economic benefits of parents, especially mothers working. We know because of the economic benefits of the business productivity. We know because of the economic benefits of the childcare sector itself produces quite a bit of money, right? That actually states will make money pretty quickly if they invest this funds. The other thing is obviously at some point, federal funding has to get unlocked. States have different levels of resources and different levels of tax bases, and it's simply unfair to say to a family or a child the quality and access to early care and education is going to depend on the zip code you happen to live in, and so the only way to smooth that over truly is going to at some point be federal funding. I sincerely hope that's sooner rather than later, but I think that still remains to be seen.
Yeah. No, I think that seeing that for the public good that it is and making this investment is going to be the key to sustaining this. And at the end of the day, we're doing this so that we're improving the lives of these children. who are in nurturing environments and high quality care. And we know that that has long-term payoffs for their health and well-being in the short term and the long term. Well, I can't thank you enough for taking time to talk with me today and to share what you have seen and really have come to be a leader in helping all of us better understand how important it is that we shore up the childcare market and make it so that our teachers will enter and stay in this important field. And at the end of the day, make sure that our families can afford high quality care for their children, and that our providers can stay in business. So, Elliot, thank you again for your time today.